The mist hung low over San Evaristo's cliffs that morning, curling like whispers through the almond trees. Isabel Martin wrapped her shawl tighter, her hands raw from milking goats before dawn. A widow at 30 with no fortune but a stubborn heart and a son too clever for his age, she worked the orchards the old count had once ruled, a count said to have vanished with scandal trailing like perfume. She didn't believe in legends. Not until that morning. A man stood beneath the gnarled tree where her son, Tomas, was swinging from a branch. The stranger had no shoes. His coat was of fine make but dirted with travel, his hair too long for fashion and too clean for a beggar. He held Tomas's boot, the boy had lost it climbing, and smiled with a warmth that unnerved her. "You shouldn't be here," she said sharply, pulling Tomas behind her. "This orchard belongs to the estate." "And yet it feeds you," the man replied, quiet and amused. There was no arrogance in his voice. Only the kind of calm that came from having once owned something, and choosing not to lord it. She narrowed her eyes, looking for deceit. He had the air of someone used to being obeyed, yet here he was, barefoot in dust, offering to help harvest almonds. She refused him twice. Told him she had no coin to offer, no roof to share. But the third time, when her back screamed from the burden and the sun bore down like judgment, she wordlessly handed him a basket. He worked in silence, side by side with her and her boy. He didn't fumble like the city men who came to hire peasants for show. His hands were rough but not from the fields, from swords or reins, perhaps. Still, he bled like any man when the husks cut his palm. And he laughed when Tomas asked if he were a thief hiding from the king. Something like that, the stranger said, ruffling the boy's hair. That evening, he disappeared into the hills. Isabel assumed he was gone for good. But at sunrise, he returned, carrying a loaf of bread and a new rope for the well. She frowned, suspicious of gifts. But the bread was warm and her son was hungry. The days slipped into rhythm. He helped chop wood, mend fences, gather honey from the cliffside hives. He asked for nothing in return. Not even a name. He told stories, though, ones Tomas begged for at night, about ships lost at sea and kingdoms buried in ice. He knew languages Isabel had only heard once at her late husband's funeral, when the bishop passed through. He quoted poets like a man raised on velvet, not dirt. Still, he slept in the hollow behind the chapel ruins. Ate whatever she gave. Vanished every night like he feared being caught. Once, when she caught him staring at the crumbling windows of the Altamira manor across the fields, she asked, "Did you know the old count?" He paused too long before answering. Only through stories. She didn't believe him. But she didn't press. There was something in his silence that felt sacred, like reaching for it might break whatever spell had allowed him to cross into their lives. In the village, tongues wagged. Men muttered about a stranger stealing work. Women muttered about Isabel's smile. She ignored them. She had done harder things. Yet in the quiet moments, when the orchard was bathed in gold, when the stranger laughed at Tomas's mischief, when he patched her roof during a rainstorm and apologized for not doing it sooner, she began to wonder if perhaps this was the kind of man who could disappear into a life like theirs. Not forever. But long enough to make it feel like the world had given something back. One night, Tomas fell asleep beside the hearth with the stranger's coat tucked around him. Isabel lifted it carefully, meaning to hang it dry. Inside the lining, hidden where seams met silk, was a crest. A crown. 3 wolves beneath it. And the letter are stitched in old gold thread. Her breath caught. She stared out the window into the orchard, now silver in moonlight. The man she knew as no one, he had once been someone. And he had come here not by accident. But by choice. The village was small and cruel with rumors. A woman seen smiling too long at a man meant she was planning sin. Isabel knew this well. Her husband had died in the mines, crushed before Tomas's 2nd birthday, and since then, she had been judged for surviving too well. A woman alone and proud was dangerous. Now she was seen with the stranger. They whispered in the plaza that he slept in the abandoned chapel, where ivy crawled across crumbling stone and bats nested in the rafters. They said he bought bread but never drank wine, as though abstaining marked him as unholy. They said he knew Latin too well to be a laborer, that his words were polished like a noble's dagger. Isabel told herself it didn't matter. He was only a man lending his hands to her fields, a shadow that eased her burdens. But when her son began calling him Señor León, and the men laughed softly, as though the name was both wrong and strangely right, she felt her stomach tighten. One stormy evening, with rain thrashing against the cottage roof and the sea wind rattling the shutters, León sat by the hearth. Tomás had fallen asleep against his side with an open book across his lap, his hair damp from chasing goats through the drizzle. Isabel poured 2 mugs of broth, her fingers trembling more from questions than the cold. She asked, not gently, who he truly was. León did not answer at once. He stared at the fire as though it might grant him courage, and the shadows carved hollows beneath his eyes. Finally, his voice came low and steady. I was once a man who mistook gold for value. Until it cost me everyone I loved. The words thickened the air between them. He spoke then of betrayal, of a brother who had stolen his inheritance with forged papers and poisoned tongues, of a fiancée who left him for the promise of rank and titles, of a court that turned its back when scandal clung too heavily to his name. I thought I was powerful, he said, the flames flickering in his eyes. But power was a cage, and it burned until nothing was left. So I left it all, the halls, the silks, the name. I buried it as one buries the dead. He paused, the storm crashing outside as though the heavens themselves bore witness. Now I live by work, not name. And for the first time in all my years, I know peace. Isabel felt her heart twist. The rain drummed harder against the windows, like 1,000 knuckles demanding entry. She looked at him, not the ragged man with blistered hands, but the hidden nobility in his voice, the scar of exile carved deep across his soul. And if your brother dies, she asked quietly, almost against her will. If they come to call you back. Leon's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he turned, and his gaze met hers with the weight of a vow. I'll vanish again, he said. I would rather be León with a shovel than Count Ramon locked in marble halls. The name hung in the air like forbidden incense. Ramon. It was a name she had heard whispered in the marketplace years ago, the disgraced heir of Altamira, said to have drowned or gone mad. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the ruined manor on the cliffs. The windows glared like hollow eyes, watching them, daring them to believe the past was truly buried. Isabel's throat felt dry. She should have sent him away then, should have barred the door and spared herself the weight of secrets. But her fingers moved of their own accord. She lifted a blanket from the chair and crossed the room. Here, she said, laying it across his shoulders. For a moment, their hands brushed. His eyes softened, though he said nothing. The storm howled, the cottage walls shook, and yet Isabel felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. She told herself it was pity. She told herself it was gratitude. But when she turned away, her lips trembled with something far more dangerous. That night, as Tomás snored softly on the hearth rug, León kept watch by the fire, the blanket still draped around him. And Isabel lay awake in her bed, listening to the storm, her heart pounding with the knowledge that the stranger under her roof was no stranger at all, but a man whose very existence could upend her world. By the time the almond trees bloomed again, their white petals drifting through the air like snowflakes from some gentler heaven, León had become a part of Isabel's life in ways she could no longer deny. He had repaired the roof with hands blistered raw, had taught Tomás to shape letters on rough parchment until the boy could proudly read aloud from the Psalms, and had built her a new coop for the hens that had once wandered into the neighbors' fields. Every task he took upon himself with quiet diligence, as though labor were his penance, and yet never once did he ask for coin or praise. But his silence spoke. His gaze lingered when she knelt to pour water, when her hair slipped from its binding and fell loose against her shoulders. His hand brushed hers deliberately when passing a cup, a touch light as air yet heavy with promise. And some nights, when the moon burned silver above the cliffs and she spun barefoot with her son in laughter and dance, León stood apart in shadow, his eyes burning with something unspoken. Once, when she dared to catch him watching, he whispered across the darkness, "You don't even know what you save." The words haunted her long after they were spoken. That spring, the quiet cracked. The Duke's men arrived. Their carriages rattled into San Evaristo like a storm, lacquered wood gleaming, horses stamping impatiently as though the humble soil itself offended them. They brought scrolls with red seals and words dipped in honey and thread alike. Invitations, they called them, though no villager dared to refuse. A ball was to be held in San Sebastián, they declared, and all houses loyal to the crown must honor it. Rumors spread like wildfire through the tavern and marketplace, that the Count of Altamira, long whispered dead, had indeed perished, leaving the title open to his elder brother, a man thought vanished or mad. Isabel saw León go still when he heard. His jaw tightened, his gaze turned toward the ruined manor on the cliff as if stone and shadow themselves accused him. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than any outcry. 2 days passed with that silence stretched like wire between them. He spoke little, worked little, and at night paced the orchard as if hunted by ghosts. On the 3rd morning, Isabel entered the cottage to find him rolling his coat, his meager belongings gathered like a thief ready to flee. "You're leaving," she said, her voice low, more accusation than question. León looked up, sorrow carved deep across his face. "They'll come for me next. Once they know I live, they'll demand I return, demand I play their games again. And I cannot bring you into that fire. It would destroy you." Her chest tightened with a fury she had long restrained. "Destroy me? I am already ruined in their eyes. I am a widow with no dowry. A son with no father. A cottage with no stone floor. What more can they take?" He stepped closer, shaking his head. "You are rich in the ways they will never understand. That is what they will steal, Isabel. They will stain it. Twist it. Use it until you are nothing but a tale to laugh at in their halls." She felt her breath falter, but she did not step back. Her eyes searched his as though clawing through years of secrets. "And you," she whispered. "Will you go to them? Pretend you never held me beneath the olive tree. Pretend my boy's laughter never pulled the shadow from your face." León parted his lips to speak, but she silenced him with the press of her hand against his chest, where the steady rhythm of his heart betrayed him. She could feel the weight of every vow he had broken, every name he had cast aside, every desire he had tried to bury under exile. "Stay, León," she whispered. "Not the Count. Not the ghost they hunt. Just the men." The orchard winds hushed. The sea beyond the cliffs thundered its eternal hymn. And then, as though the world itself demanded it, León bent to her. The kiss tore through years of silence, of restraint, of exile. It was not gentle. It was desperate, consuming, like a man drowning, and only her lips could give him breath. His hands, rough and scarred, cradled her face as if she were both sanctuary and salvation. The taste of salt lingered, salt from her tears, from the storm winds that slipped through the shuttered cottage, from the grief he had carried like chains. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with release. Every title, every whispered rumor, every cruel gaze from villagers fell away. There was only this moment, raw and unadorned, where a disgraced count and a poor widow ceased to exist. Only a man and a woman remained, bound by the fire they could no longer deny. When at last he drew back, his forehead rested against hers, his breath ragged. "I swore I would never fall again," he murmured, voice breaking. "But you undo me." Her fingers lingered at his jaw, tracing the faint stubble, the fragile truth beneath his hardened shell. "Then let yourself be undone," she said. "What is a life if it cannot be lived true?" The words cracked something inside him. His arms tightened around her, pulling her against him, as if holding her could shield them from the summons of dukes and courts and crowns. Outside, the almond blossoms swirled, carried on the sea wind, drifting against the window like white fire. Tomas stirred in his sleep, mumbling words from a half-remembered dream, and the spell held them all, the child's innocence, the widow's defiance, the exile's surrender. For a heartbeat, León believed. Believed he could stay, that the world beyond the orchard need never reclaim him. That the sea wind would carry their secrets away and bury them in salt and foam. But in the distance, a bell tolled from the chapel ruins, though no hand pulled its rope. The sound echoed through the valley, hollow and insistent, like a summons none could refuse. León closed his eyes. Isabel held him tighter. And though neither spoke, both knew the kiss that had awakened their hearts had also awakened the world that sought to tear them apart. Yet even as dread whispered through him, León clung to her. For that single night, in the fragile glow of the fire, he was not a count, nor a fugitive, nor a man shaped by grief. He was simply hers. And though the dawn would come, and with it, carriages, letters, and fate itself, he kissed her again, like the world was ending, like it had already ended, and only she remained to make it worth living. They came before dawn, when the sea mist still clung to the earth and the roosters had not yet cried. Not soldiers, but messengers draped in navy velvet, their cloaks heavy with the Duke's crest, their gloves too fine for common soil. They rode into San Evaristo like shadows, bearing letters sealed in red wax, their presence a chill reminder that the world beyond the orchard had not forgotten. The villagers gathered, barefoot and bleary-eyed, as the proclamations were read aloud. Count Ramon de Altamira was summoned to reclaim his family's lands. The Duke demanded his presence. The province expected their noble. The name carried weight, rolling from the messenger's lips like a stone cast into still water. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, eyes darting to the men they had known only as León, the wanderer who had mended roofs, carried water, and shared his bread. He did not hide. He did not deny. He stood before them at the heart of the plaza, not in silks or polished boots but in his workman's shirt, the fabric stained with soil and sweat, the leather of his shoes cracked from labor. He did not stand as the count they expected, but as the men the village had come to know. And when he spoke, it was not of gold or bloodlines. "I have married Isabel Martin," he declared, his voice carrying over the hush, each word striking like a hammer on iron. "Not by decree of church or crown. Not by arrangement of lords or politics. But by the vow of two hearts that chose each other freely." The air trembled with shock. Gasps rose like waves, sharp and disbelieving. Some turned away, faces twisted with disdain. Others clutched their rosaries, muttering of sin and scandal, of a noble tainted by the embrace of a widow who owned nothing but her pride. Children clung to their mother's skirts, sensing the tension that rippled through the groan. But Isabel stood tall at his side, her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders, her chin lifted as though daring anyone to name her unworthy. Her hand rested in his, fingers interlaced with quiet strength, and though her heart pounded, she refused to tremble. Tomas stepped forward, his small chest puffed with the courage of youth. He did not hide behind her skirts as he once might have. He looked up at the men who had become his father, his protector, his teacher, and smiled, without fear, without shame. The messengers exchanged uneasy glances, their velvet cloaks whispering against one another as though even their finery could not shield them from the audacity of what had just been declared. They had expected a count humbled into obedience, a penitent noble eager to reclaim honor through submission. Instead, they had found a man who had built his life anew and chosen a bride the world called unworthy. The manor awaited them, grand in its ruin, but they did not move into its cold halls. Ramon, no longer hiding behind León, no longer a shadow, sold it without hesitation. The gold he had hidden, safeguarded through years of exile, was not used for silks or jewels, nor for restoring portraits of ancestors who had long turned to dust. He poured it instead into the heart of San Evaristo. A school rose where children once played in dust, its walls whitewashed, its benches filled with eager faces who now carried books instead of burdens. A small clinic opened by the chapel ruins, its doors never shut, its shelves stocked with herbs, bandages, and the promise of care for those who could not pay. New roofs gleamed in the sunlight atop the cottages of widows who had lived too long under leaking straw, each one a silent blessing laid upon the village by the men who had once been their stranger. Whispers that had once carried mockery began to soften. Even the bitterest tongues faltered when their children learned to read, when their wounds were dressed without coin demanded. Yet still, some clung to disdain, muttering that no true noble would choose a woman so low, a house so humble. But Ramon and Isabel lived quietly, loved loudly. Their laughter echoed in the orchards, their footsteps pressed into the soil with the steadiness of belonging. She baked bread that carried the scent of rosemary through the streets. He repaired plows and fences with the same hands that had once been trained for war and ceremony. Together, they wove a life stitched not from duty or wealth, but from defiance and devotion. When the Duke's men returned with new letters, heavier in tone, commanding the Count to present himself at court, Ramon's reply was brief. One line, ink steady and unshaken: "I serve only what is true." The Duke raged, no doubt, behind walls of marble and silk. But in San Evaristo, the orchards thrived. Blossoms burst brighter, the almond trees heavy with promise, as if the land itself rejoiced in the union it sheltered. It was beneath those trees, in the same orchard where a barefoot stranger had once held a child's lost boot, that Isabel often walked at dusk. Her son raced ahead, chasing fireflies through the rows, while Ramon strolled beside her, his hand brushing hers in that quiet, grounding way that had become their unspoken vow. She remembered the nights when villagers spat at her door, when she was judged for working too hard, for speaking too boldly, for surviving when survival itself was condemned. She remembered the ache of loneliness, the weight of raising a child with no name to shield him. And now she stood as the wife of a man once bound by crowns, yet freed by her embrace. She was no longer the widow whispered about at the well, no longer the fool chasing hope in empty fields. She was the richest woman in all the province, though not a coin rested in her pocket. Her wealth was in the laughter of her son, the warmth of her husband's gaze, the strength of a love that defied decree and expectation. The villagers would remember. Some would curse. Some would envy. Some would secretly bless. But Isabel knew the truth, that riches measured in gold fade, crumble, vanish with the turning of seasons. The fortune she had found, the fortune she had given him, was eternal. She had taught a broken noble that love was the only wealth worth keeping. And in return, he had given her a life where dignity was no longer borrowed, but claimed. And so the orchard bore witness, its blossoms scattering with every wind, its branches heavy with fruit, its roots deep and unyielding. Just like their love, unshaken by crowns, unbroken by whispers, and unstoppable even by the hand of the Duke himself.